So, the Chapter 5 lecture on the American Revolution begins with a discussion of taxation. Of course, in elementary school you learn the reasons for the American Revolution are primarily because of taxation without representation. Well, that is one piece of the puzzle. The British government had a lot of debts after the French and Indian War, and they wanted the British North American colonies to pony up and help pay for these massive debts because A, they didn't pay near as many taxes as people back in the homeland of Britain did, and B, that they had been the primary beneficiary of the war itself. In addition to these new taxes, the government starts instituting what comes to be known as writs of assistance. This is essentially anytime you choose search warrant, you just pull out writ of assistance and you can search someone's home or property on a whim. This, when the Constitution is being written and discussed, is a direct link to the concern that leads to writing the Fourth Amendment, which protects against illegal search and seizure. One of the particular taxes that really had people upset was the Stamp Act. Any kind of printed material had to have a stamp on it from the British government authorities, essentially meaning you already paid your tax on this. This is an acceptable item to have. This was the first direct tax on the colonies, and very, very unpopular because nearly everybody is hit by this tax. Even lower class folks are hit by this tax. So it's very, very controversial and widespread in its controversy. You can see this handbill, more of a political advertisement. It says, "The first man that either distributes or makes use of stamped paper, let him take care of his house, person, and effects." In 1760s language, this means don't cooperate with the British, or we will burn down your house, or we will attack you, or we will rob you. So it's a threat. This concern over the taxation primarily has to do with the fact that people in the colonies feel as though they do not have the same voice in the government that people back in Britain have. So they consider themselves British citizens and believe that they have rights inherent to Englishmen. But the direct taxation is the big issue. Prior to this, there were limitations on trade, like the Navigation Acts. But this is the first time, the Stamp Act that is, that there is a direct tax on the people. Most people during the Navigation Acts actually thought it was their patriotic duty to trade within the British Empire. So the whole limitations on trade was actually somewhat accepted, and it's this direct tax that is most concerning, especially because there were no colonial representatives in the Parliament, and nobody back in Britain was really voicing these concerns either, which leads to this famous, you learn in elementary school, no taxation without representation. Mob politics, the Sons of Liberty. So, a large elm tree in Boston on which protesters had hung in effigy the stamp distributor named Andrew Oliver to persuade him to resign his position as tax collector and stamp distributor, came to be known as the Liberty Tree. And then in New York City, a pine mast is put up by hand as a meeting place for opponents of the Stamp Act, and that's called the Liberty Pole. So you've got two major cities with groups of people that like have formal gathering places to protest against the British government. During a particular protest in Boston, the Massachusetts colonial governor Thomas Hutchinson's home is actually overrun and ransacked. He has to escape out the back, and they actually destroy a lot of the property of his inside the house. Now, protests did finally bring an end to the Stamp Act. The British government realized this is so unpopular that we should repeal it. So the tax actually only lasted for about a year. Now, Parliament did, however, ruffle feathers again when they said that taxes could only be levied on them by elected legislatures, and that they needed to respect the power of that elected legislature, so Parliament. Again, this ties back into, but we don't have a representative in Parliament, by passing the Declaratory Act. All of these things are escalating issues that lead to the growth of the group, the Sons of Liberty, primarily in Boston. There are chapters in other cities, but Boston is the most famous chapter of the Sons of Liberty. It included men like John Hancock, Samuel Adams, Paul Revere, John Adams, and lesser known, but certainly not less significant, was a doctor by the name of Joseph Warren, who was very much involved with Sam Adams, his cousin John, John Hancock, and Paul Revere. This is all really well depicted in the History Channel docudrama series called Sons of Liberty. There are some historical inaccuracies. I'm not going to lie to you and say that it is beautifully historically accurate. But I do think that if somebody finds this entertaining enough to want to pay more attention to American history and the story of the American Revolution, that's a win, like getting people to pay attention to a historical topic. So you can see the characters here. First, I mentioned before, is Dr. Joseph Warren. Second here is Paul Revere. Probably the main focal character here. Third is Sam Adams, John Hancock, and John Adams. And these are the major players of the docudrama series. It is quite good. I will make sure it is posted to classrooms so that you could watch it if you wish. And it puts like dramatic scenes to some of the events that you're hearing in this lecture. Now, the Townsend Acts. When they protested the Stamp Act, some colonists, including Ben Franklin, seemed to suggest they would not object if Britain raised revenue by regulating trade rather than these direct taxes. This was only true, though, because it was very easy to evade these regulatory taxes. John Hancock had made a whole rich, wealthy merchant's career out of evading regulatory taxes. So anyway, the chief financial officer of the Crown, by the name of Charles Townsend, so these acts get named for him, instituted new taxes and created a new board of customs to collect them. And things get very, very heated again, even worse than the Stamp Act, because now there are multiple taxes being enforced by this new board of customs. So these rich merchants, like John Hancock, deliberately try to evade the taxes, but they end up having their cargo seized by the British government that are using writs of assistance against them. So there's really no hiding from the power and scope of the British government. It is this that leads, this attitude of the British are being greedy with their taxes, that leads to this concept of homespun virtue. Now, homespun makes you think of cloth only, but really this is a widespread attitude of avoiding trading with the British Empire if you can. So they produce cloth, but also other goods at home rather than buying British goods. Let's take as much wealth and possible tax revenue out of the British coffers. This is seen as very self-sacrificial, so you're doing something on behalf of everybody. And women who spun their own cloth and led some of these movements came to be known as the Daughters of Liberty. So you had the Sons of Liberty that were protesting and doing things eventually like the Boston Tea Party in response to the Tea Act, but the Daughters of Liberty are the ones supporting the home production of goods to keep money from being made by the British government. So, the Boston Massacre. This is a very interesting historical story because in reality, this is a mob. This is chaos. This is anarchy. It got out of control and there was firing into a crowd. But what the colonists are made to believe are what they see when Paul Revere produces this engraving that you see on the right, and the soldiers are accused of more or less just aiming and firing at indiscriminately these poor innocent Bostonians and murdering them. Believe it or not, even though he ends up being a key player in the Sons of Liberty and the independence movement, John Adams, in fact, defends the soldiers accused of murdering Bostonians at their trial. And he does not win over any friends in the colonies doing this, but he believed very strongly in a person's right to counsel when going to trial. So he believed very strongly in legal representation, and this is actually also depicted when the Founding Fathers write the Constitution, because your legal rights that are outlined in the 4th through 8th Amendments is including this right to legal representation. So this actually, the John Adams defending the British soldiers from the Boston Massacre, is very well depicted in the HBO miniseries John Adams, in which Paul Giamatti plays John Adams, and there's a particular episode in which this defense of these soldiers is very well depicted. So the Tea Act, as I mentioned before, you had the Tea Act, and really it was more a tax credit to the British East Indian Company than it was a tax. People think of it as a tea tax. Well, really, it just meant that the British East India Company was getting government aid. This allowed them to sell their tea at low prices, and the low prices undercut established merchants and smugglers in the colonies. So men like John Hancock, who maybe had tea of their own, but had paid a certain amount for it and wouldn't sell it for any less, are undercut by the British East India Company. So the response is the Boston Tea Party. So like I said, this is not a tea tax. There had always been a tea tax. There had always been a tea tax. People were not necessarily opposed to this tea tax that had always existed. What they were opposed to was the unfair advantage that the British East India Company was being given. So oftentimes people learn of this, again, one of those like elementary school misconceptions that this was about a tax. It was more about a tax credit that had been given to the British East India Company. So anyway, they have the Boston Tea Party in December 1773, and in response, the British pass the Intolerable Acts, and things start to escalate even more from here. Because the Intolerable Acts say, we are closing the port of Boston. There will be no trade in or out of Boston until the tea that you dumped into the harbor is paid for. We are eliminating the Massachusetts charter and making all positions that were once elected to be appointed by the colonial governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony or the Crown itself. It allowed for royal officials to be removed to England for trial for any crimes committed in the colonies. So really you could whisk them away and they could get away with something that they had done against the colonists in the Americas. And troops can now be quartered in the homes of colonists. Now, this right here is yet another example of one of the things that some of the founding fathers were highly concerned could be done to them again, and they include this as the Third Amendment to the Constitution in the Bill of Rights against the quartering of troops in people's homes during peacetime. So, in response to all this, the First Continental Congress is called together, and representatives from 12 colonies attend. Georgia is the only colony that did not attend. They were very, very heavily loyal to the British in 1773 and 4 when this was taking place. You see this famous painting here, Bostonians paying the excise man. So here's a tax collector being tarred, feathered, and having hot tea poured down his throat. Yeah, this is a very, very, very graphic thing to do, but you could see here they are under the Liberty Tree. Here's goods being poured into the harbor, and here's the poor excise man having tea poured down his throat after being tarred and feathered. But back to the First Continental Congress. Patrick Henry is a famous orator from Virginia and was very aggressive in his speech toward the British Crown. And all of these actions that had primarily been things that were making Bostonians mad, he is quoted as saying, "The distinctions between Virginians, Pennsylvanians, New Yorkers, and New Englanders are no more. I am not a Virginian, but an American." And this is one of the first recorded statements of people starting to band together across the British colonies against the British. Very stark in contrast to when Ben Franklin drafted the Albany Plan of Union in 1754 at the onset of the French and Indian War, and it failed miserably because all the colonies wanted their own autonomy. Well, now you're starting to see them band together more. And even more famously, of course, Henry declared, "Give me liberty or give me death." And it is this that is the title of our textbook that we use in class, Give Me Liberty by Eric Foner. So Patrick Henry is really bold, and he's shooting his mouth off, but everybody else is a whole lot more cautious in their public statements because they don't want to be hung for treason or something crazy like that. So rather than bold public statements, they started forming what was known as committees of safety. And these committees of safety are essentially secret meetings, secret local communities, where they would air out their laundry. It's a saying, air out their laundry in private, rather than depending on the colonial government that they knew would report back to the British. Here is a depiction of Patrick Henry in his younger years when he would have been making this speech. And he's really, he's a firecracker. but he was not really somebody everybody was rallying around. They were still very afraid of British power. Lexington and Concord. Probably one of the most famous moments in all of human history, let alone American history. So, the person in charge, if you remember me mentioning colonial governor Thomas Hutchinson. Thomas Hutchinson is seen more or less as a failure, and he's replaced, and not only replaced, but with a military general, man by the name of Thomas Gage. And he's now in charge. This is April of 1775, by the way, and he sends the British infantry to march towards the town of Concord to seize weapons that he hears are being stockpiled by men like Sam Adams. When Paul Revere hears of the march on Concord through the rebel spy network, he and a friend, William Dawes, ride out to warn the countryside that the regulars are coming in force. This is something we will refer back to. Regulars versus militia. And after some skirmishes in both Lexington and Concord, the British retreat back to Boston and are actually met with guerrilla attacks from the surrounding forest as they return. It is the first shot at Lexington, though, that comes to be known as the shot heard around the world. That really the shot that started the American Revolution. Because there are a lot of people, including Thomas Paine, who we know after our class discussions writes Common Sense, that are going from maybe on the fence, or they're upset with Britain, but they're willing to work within the system to try to fix things. And it is this moment, Lexington and Concord, well depicted in this painting here, that leads people to say, nope, this is it. Now things have gotten completely out of control, and we need to declare independence from Britain. And that's certainly the case for Thomas Paine, which we will come back to. The man in charge of the militia forces of the colonists at Lexington was a man by the name of Captain John Parker. There is a monument to him in Lexington to this day, and this image of his monument is often used today by Second Amendment advocacy groups as symbolic of why common citizens need the right to keep and bear arms, as it is described in the Second Amendment. And again, Lexington and Concord, the right to bear arms, things that the Founding Fathers believed in very strongly, hence they were included in the original Constitution via the Bill of Rights. The day of the attack, as the British are marching toward them, John Parker is quoted by many people at the scene as having shouted, "Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." So, essentially saying, we are not going to be the ones to fire first. We are not going to be guilty of treason. But if they want to start a fight, then by all means, we are here to fight back. And, like I said, it is Lexington and Concord that really convinces a lot of people that pleas for changes to the British government are falling on deaf ears, and they have nothing left to do but to fight for their rights. So after the Battle of Lexington and Concord in April of 1775, the Continental Congress is called together again, and historically it's the same or similar group of people, but historically there needs to be a distinction between that meeting at which they were the reason they were meeting was because of the Battle of Lexington and Concord. So that's where historically you hear the terms First and then Second Continental Congress. Now, at this meeting, there's a lot of anger with the British Crown, but it's still agreed upon that, hey, there needs to be one last-ditch effort at peace and negotiation with the Crown. So the Olive Branch petition is drafted and sent to the king, but it is immediately rejected without even being heard. And in response, there is instead a proclamation of rebellion that says, hey, government officials in the colonies, loyal subjects of the Crown in the colonies, do everything you can to suppress this rebellion. And they also started deploying additional troops to the colonies to put down this rebellion. In the late spring and summer and fall of 1775, a man by the name of Thomas Paine writes his famous piece, Common Sense, of which we will read sections of in class. Now, Paine argues John Lockean type thoughts that while a constitutional monarchy can be limited with more powers in Parliament, he still thought more specific limitations of government power are needed, and that there, instead of any form of a crown, needed to be instead a republican constitution. And that is as we've discussed before, extremely radical concept in this time period. Paine spends most of the document listing the reasons why membership in the British Empire has only hurt the American colonies and American colonists, and how independence would actually allow America to prosper above and beyond anything that they had ever accomplished as members of the British Empire. Paine's writing is really, the sole purpose of it is to convince people to support declaring independence from the Crown. In this famous document, Thomas Jefferson, with the help in the editing stages of Benjamin Franklin and John Adams, and you can see them all depicted in this painting, the famous language of all men are created equal, they have certain inalienable rights, is the way that they were worded in the Declaration, but really this is John Locke's thoughts of natural rights. And then life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Again, this sounds a lot like Locke's life, liberty, and property. Now, the biggest statement here, justification for declaring independence, that any unjust government could and should be overthrown by its people. And then the remainder of the document is a list of grievances. This is actually language that the Regents exam likes to use, like in multiple choice sections of tests. The document is really just, the thesis is what I just circled, that unjust governments should be overthrown. And then the body of the document is just hitting point after point after point. It's almost like the closing argument of a trial in writing. And here is a famous painting of, after the Declaration of Independence, a statue of King George being pulled down in New York City. Or maybe this is Boston. Don't quote me on that. But this is definitely a statue of King George being yanked down by the people, and very, very well-known painting to historians. Now, as they go into the war, it looks like, for the most part, that this is hopeless for the colonists. This is not going to go well, because the British have the most powerful army and navy in the world. in the past 200 years, since the Spanish Armada, really, no one has defeated the British in a war. Might defeat the British in an individual battle, but no one has ever defeated the British in a war in the last 200 years. Also, the ability to raise funds and pay for the war. They are an established nation. Okay? The Americans, on the other hand, are going to need to find allies that will support them and give them their needed money to pay for the resistance. And these stronger finances also allow the British to hire Hessian mercenaries. Now, Hessians, they're really German. And for this time period, they are the Navy SEALs of their time. They are the most trained, the best individual soldier in the world. Yes, the British Army and Navy are the most powerful. The nation is the most powerful, but the individual trained soldier is a Hessian. And the British hire these Hessian mercenaries, and we will come back to this when we discuss the Battle of Trenton in particular. So the British seem to have everything going for them. However, there are some things the Americans have going for them. The British are fighting far from home. So this whole concept of home turf, home field advantage, that is an American advantage. The British, if they need reinforcements, they have to come across an ocean. Supplies often have to come across an ocean. Americans can recruit more soldiers right within the colonies. And via that concept of homespun virtue that we've mentioned in class, a lot of what needs to be produced is produced within the colonies in secret. So Americans also have the support of local populations. The British control major cities like Boston and New York, but the majority of the countryside supports the rebels. And Americans, probably the single most important thing is the cause. We have this cause to fight for. British soldiers are just doing what the Crown says. They're doing what is ordered of them. It's their job. And eventually, a long and expensive war works on behalf of the Americans, because the average British citizen finally, in the end, and we'll come back to this again with the Battle of Yorktown, finally just says, just let them have their independence. Let's be done with this. So this chart really does a good job of summarizing the British and American strengths and weaknesses. Now, in the early stages, the earliest fighting, it looks, again, like the British are going to annihilate the Americans. After Lexington and Concord, the colonial militia forces gather together around Boston. They surround, they get some cannons that have been brought from Fort Ticonderoga. That's a great story, where they all the way from Fort Ticonderoga to Boston, through the woods, through awful conditions, brought all these cannons, and they got them up onto what was known as Bemis Heights in Boston, looking down on the British, and it really forces the British retreat. And an even better detail to that story is that they didn't even have the power and the powder and the cannonballs to actually attack the British, but it looked good to have all those cannons. And so the British retreat from Boston, but after leaving Boston, the British arrive in New York. They want a major port of trade after losing Boston. Boston was the largest port of trade, and to have a foothold from which to fight the war. They need a place to bring in reinforcements. They need a place to bring in supplies, and New York is that place. They also think that they can take a divide and conquer strategy from New York, which we will come back to here in a few minutes. Now, by the winter of 1776-77, Washington's army had shrunk from a force of nearly 30,000 to fewer than 3,000, and many of whom weren't fit for battle. They're suffering from frostbite, dysentery, smallpox. This is an army in disarray. There's many POWs that the British have taken. They are throwing them on ships in New York Harbor. And disease is spreading there awfully too. And others have deserted. They're thinking, we are doomed. There is no way that we can continue this fight. So you can see on these maps to the right the Battle of Long Island and eventually the retreat from New York. All of the fighting in New York is an absolute travesty for Washington and his troops. So eventually, Washington and his troops retreat from New York and are moving through New Jersey into what is often referred to as the tri-state area. So the New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania intersection where they all come together on a map. And this is where we have the famous story of the Battle of Trenton and another famous writing from Thomas Paine. So Washington's army is quite literally decimated by the Battle of Long Island, by the Battle of Harlem Heights, the Battle of Brooklyn. He has to abandon two major forts on the Hudson River, Fort Washington and Fort Lee. 3,000 men are taken as prisoners in the escape from these two forts. Now they finally escape across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. They are very temporarily safe, but not for long. The minute the river sections of the river freeze over, the superior British forces are going to be able to march across the frozen river and attack. So Washington needs to come up with a plan. And his plan becomes crossing the Delaware River, marching down to Trenton, New Jersey, and attacking the fort at Trenton that is protected by Hessian mercenaries. Now, most of his subordinate generals and colonels, when he presents this plan to them, look at him like, are you nuts? This is a suicide mission. And he convinces them, however, that it might be a suicide mission, but I think we can do it. And if we choose not to do it, the same outcome happens. We will lose. So we either fight one last battle and lose, or we lose by sitting on our hands. And so he convinces the subordinate leaders to support him, and they attack Trenton. It goes miraculously well. Not a single casualty is suffered by the Americans, and the Hessians are surprised and surrender. Now, very, very famous painting, a copy of this hangs in my classroom. Not exactly accurate. He's all proudly standing up in the boat, and somebody's waving a flag, and they're going to be hunkered down in this boat to not go overboard. So this is a little exaggerated. But famous quote from another writing by Thomas Paine that was supposed to be more or less a rah-rah speech to the troops, and it was. Washington has it read aloud to the troops right before attacking Trenton, and it's really rallying these men who are seeing that this could possibly go very, very badly for us. And this quote: "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of his country. But he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman." The whole document is beautiful. This is probably the most famous quote. And it does. It provides some motivation, and they win the Battle of Trenton. They follow it up with a victory at the Battle of Princeton, New Jersey, and all of a sudden there's new life to the colonial cause. I mentioned before a British divide and conquer strategy. The British wanted to, via the Hudson River and control the port of New York, bring General Howe up the Hudson River from New York. At the same time, they were going to have a general by the name of St. Leger move through the Mohawk River Valley, while a general by the name of Johnny Burgoyne, who was actually a very arrogant guy and almost guaranteed victory before marching on this mission of a divide and conquer, and coming south from Fort Ticonderoga. And the goal is to converge on and conquer Albany. And this would effectively, from New York, Fort Ticonderoga, Fort Oswego, and Albany, create a split in the colonies. It would separate New England from the middle and southern colonies, and they could then, go from the inside out to defeat this rebellion. Howe, being a bit of a glory hound, moves on Philadelphia instead of Albany, because he figures, if I can take the rebel capital city, this war is over. Well, first of all, you're fighting a guerrilla enemy. That's not exactly how it's going to work. This is not gentlemanly warfare that you're used to. Just taking the capital city is not necessarily going to win the war. And it goes against the divide and conquer strategy. St. Leger is held up in battles in the Mohawk Valley. All of the roads that he is trying to go down, colonists are cutting down trees and blocking his path, etc. And one of the most famous battles, you can visit this battlefield, is the Battle of Oriskany, not far from us, maybe an hour. And lastly, Burgoyne's officer corps is absolutely decimated by sharpshooter attacks, even while he's winning battles. So he's winning battles, but he is losing officers along the way, and so he might be winning the battles, but he's losing the war. Saratoga is considered the turning point of the revolution. So this divide and conquer that we just went over in the last slide really comes to a head at Saratoga. So this is actually a series of battles. The Battle of Saratoga is actually 2 or 3 different battles. And in the first battle, known as the Battle of Freeman's Farm, the British actually win. But, as I mentioned before, officers are dying in droves in battle because sharpshooters, particularly those led by Daniel Morgan, are being targeted. And in this time period, without officers to lead the troops, sometimes it turns into chaos, and that's not a good thing in 1700s military strategy. So the second battle of Bemis Heights was an American victory due to British disorganization, so again from the lack of officers that remain, and it allowed General Gates to surround Burgoyne's forces, and a large number of forces are forced to surrender to the Americans. I will show you all of this here on a map. So you see here the Battle of Bemis Heights here, and it is that circle I just drew, Gates's ability to surround the British forces that ends this battle, and forces this big surrender. Now, why is it the turning point? If I go back, it's because the Franco-American alliance, the French come in on our side at this point. So now we have a formal financial backer. We have a powerful navy that's going to be willing to help us out, and reinforcements for the army as well. Why did this happen? Well, first of all, General Howe is supposed to be coming up from New York. Again, here's Albany. That's the goal. Saratoga obviously stopped this goal from being able to take place. The Battle of Oriskany here kept St. Leger coming from the fort of Oswego through the Mohawk River Valley, held him up. So now Burgoyne at Saratoga, both Freeman's Farm and Bemis Heights, Burgoyne is here flapping in the breeze on his own instead of two other armies there to help crush the Americans. So really, it is some of this block St. Leger using, cutting trees down in the roads to slow them down, fighting the Battle of Oriskany. It is Howe's irresponsibility of going to Philadelphia rather than coming up the Hudson River Valley towards Albany. There are many small things that all come together to make Saratoga happen, which is another great example of how single moments in history sometimes alter everything. The moment that Howe decides to march on Philadelphia changes things. The moment that St. Leger is held up from coming to Burgoyne's aid, this changes things. So sometimes this concept of single moments in time are quite significant. So, the end of the war is a series of sneaky victories and strategic withdrawals. So, Daniel Morgan, again, the sharpshooter from the Battle of Saratoga, wins a strategic victory at Cowpens in South Carolina. The ending battle in the movie The Patriot, starring Mel Gibson. Mel Gibson's character is actually based loosely around Daniel Morgan. That final battle is based on Cowpens. Nathaniel Greene utilizes strategic withdrawals in North Carolina to fight again another day. This gradually exhausts the British forces. Nathaniel Greene, at one point, actually takes his already much smaller than the British force and divides it, and then General Cornwallis, the man in charge of the war in the South, is dividing his army, and then Greene quickly brings his army back together again to attack one of the pieces of the British army. So lots of strategery going on. I know that's a made-up word, but lots of strategery going on. So with all this chaos, Cornwallis is told by the British to maintain a deep water port in the south in order to maintain resupply and reinforcements. He chooses Yorktown, Virginia, which turns out to be an epic train wreck for the British. Cornwallis is surrounded. By now, the Franco-American alliance is bearing fruit, meaning that they're finally able to send reinforcements. So they're helping with the surrounding of Yorktown. They also are sending their navy. So the part of Cornwallis's ability to escape by jumping on British naval vessels and leaving is cut off because of the French Navy. Now, the biggest reason after the Battle of Yorktown is lost, and is known as the straw that broke the camel's back, per se, is that the British people back in Europe are sick of funding the war. They think it is so expensive that the resources necessary to win are just not worth it. They could win. They know they can win. We have the most powerful nation in the world with the most powerful military in the world, and we can definitely win this war, but is it worth it? And the average British citizen back in Europe is saying, no, it's not worth it. So they pressure the British government to end the revolution, and that's precisely what they do a couple years later at the Treaty of Paris. Is formally signed, ending the revolution and founding the United States of America. So here is a headline from October of 1781. Cornwallis, who actually was too big of a pansy to show up to the surrendering ceremony, he made one of his subordinate commanders deliver his sword to the American forces. And here it is. The world turned upside down. The world has absolutely been turned upside down when the United States is founded after the Revolutionary War. And this is because the age of revolution is born from this. Other nations, other colonies decide, you know what? We don't like our government either. We don't like our mother country either. So the French Revolution happened shortly after this. The Latin American rebellions against European colonizers happened after this. So the American Revolution is not only significant to our own American history, but to world history as well. That's the end of the lecture. If you have any questions, absolutely reach out. And I will see you in class.